to the question of its relevance to modern society. And I need your help this time to set the agenda for the discussion of the next 3 to 4 weeks. In other words, we are now in this critical juncture that presumably we've given an overview of some of the most salient features of the Confucian tradition. And yet the tradition has been greatly marginalized, especially in East Asia, because of the power of the modern West. And we're very familiar with the rhetoric of this particular power. I will give just a very brief account of the issues involved. Then I will ask inputs from you to help us to identify some of the critical issues for further exploration. The story actually is a very simple one. That with the rise of the modern West, roughly from the period of the Enlightenment of the 17th century and 18th century, the rules of the game in the international community have been very much shaped by the modern West. All the spiritual traditions in the world, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, certainly Confucianism and Taoism, have become somewhat silenced, at least for some time. The emergence of a new ideology, which is so pervasive, so powerful, is what I characterize here as the Enlightenment mentality. I'm not talking about the particular Enlightenment movement in modern Western history, 17th century, 18th century, the Age of Reason. I'm not necessarily referring to that historical moment. I'm not necessarily referring to some of the people called the Enlightenment Project, the Enlightenment ideas that in democracy, in human rights, or certainly in liberty. And these ideas are still being developed. And some people hope that these ideas will become more widely spread and eventually become the common human heritage. I'm not referring to that either. I'm referring to a particular mode of thinking, an ethos, a way of looking at things. And this mode of thinking is so powerful and pervasive that the Confucian tradition, pitted against it, seems somewhat powerless and without influence. I want to underscore this very powerful movement, and then to see whether in this particular context a possibility of certain kind of, if not collaboration, certain kind of mutual referencing is possible. So this is very much the challenge before us. The power of the modern West, as I noted in the outline, is defined, of course, in terms of science and technology, the market economy, democratic polity, the emergence of the civil society, and also the idea of the dignity of the individual. Sometimes people characterize this as individualism. And these are very easy to understand and very common to us because this whole process of the emergence of the West has been characterized as Westernization. And the Westernization originated in the Western European countries, but then, of course, is very much an Americanization. Is perhaps the most powerful ideology in human history. No one has ever experienced something of this magnitude, this incredible transformative influence. Every part of the world, every corner has been affected. The first question I want to raise in this connection, I need your help, is the difference between Westernization, modernization, and globalization. We don't have to have definitions, but we have some ideas what we're talking about. Will anyone first help to make the distinction between westernization and modernization? What is the difference? Is the difference between, say, westernization and modernization? Yes?
Many developing countries, it's a crucial choice. Turkey chose to pursue modernization without trying to pursue modernization without pursuing westernization. So modernization doesn't necessarily entail westernization. Westernization is a form of cultural conformity, whereas modernization has to do with science and technology, the progress of civilization as a whole, rather than civilization in different parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Now, westernization is, of course, geographically noted. And modernization may be considered as not just conceptual, in terms of more universalizing forces. They originated from the West, but they're not necessarily structurally part of the West. They can be imported to many other societies. So people prefer, in developing societies, people prefer to use modernization. We want to be modernized, and some people say we want to be modernized, but we don't want to be westernized. But for many other societies, modernization, there's only one model of modernization, which is westernization. So you cannot afford not to be westernized if you want to be modernized. Now, let's take another one, the distinction between modernization and globalization. Anyone? What's the difference between modernization and globalization? Globalization, the term globalization actually occurred rather recently, only in the last 10, 15 years. Why the word globalization now becomes in vogue, whereas of course modernization is still very, very widely discussed. What is the difference? Just sort of your gut feelings. Yes?
Modernization, everything becomes modern, where globalization is the interaction between the pre-modern or traditional and the modern.
That's helpful. In fact, in the 60s, early 60s, when I first came to the States for graduate work, Harvard is a great place for the study of modernization. Modernization actually was conceived as a process of homogenization. In other words, a process you call it industrialization, urbanization, the spread of science and technology, the spread of the influence of rationality. By the way, Max Weber, the great sociologist, defined modernization in terms of rationalization. The rationalization of labor, the rationalization of institutions, the rationalization of society. So this modernizing process eventually will undermine all kinds of differences. So there was a belief, very strong belief, that modernization as a form of westernization, but not just identical to westernization, is such a homogenizing process that eventually all societies that become modernized would be more or less the same. So an urbanized society in the United States, in New York, and a highly urbanized society in Japan, like Tokyo, or urbanized society in Southeast Asia, Singapore, they face the same problems. They will be more or less the same. So all the modernizing societies through urbanization, industrialization, and so forth will gradually, this is called the theory of convergence. They all converge into a particular pattern. So you also can imagine the modernizing process as a process that leading towards some kind of unified experience. But globalization in the last, say, 15 years, problematized, I don't like that word, problematized in the meaning to make modernization becomes much more problematical. The globalizing process, one very distinctive feature of globalization is that globalization always entails localization. And there's interplay between the globalizing process and localizing process. And some people try to coin a rather awkward English word, but it's very useful. It's called the glocal process. Global, local, the glocal. The more you globalize, the more you also become localized. This is a new phenomenon that has a lot to do with information technology, but all kinds of other possibilities. And this new phenomenon forces us, compels us to look at the problem of modernization and the westernization in a new light. And yet, there's no problem of the fact that when we talk about the globalizing process, modernization, now even Americanization, is a very important feature. The language, English, become widely used. American way of life, American pop culture, especially music, has become widespread. Of course, the McDonald phenomena and so forth. And here we identify, there's no question about the fact that the most important engine for the modernizing process is science and technology. Sometimes people say more technology than science. This is totally cultural free on the surface, but now it becomes also problematical. It's difficult to imagine there are other traditions of science that could be considered as significant, as important as the tradition of science we understand it today, studied in our universities. It's totally universalizing. You may have Chinese literature. It's difficult to say Chinese physics. It's different from English physics. So technology and science are the one of the most important universalizing processes. For a while, some people believe that there are different ways of organizing our economy. There's no need for us to rely upon the market. We can have a planned economy. Since the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and now China becomes a part of the marketized economy, China wants to get into a WTO, market economy now becomes universal. It's not possible to imagine a complex modern society without market economy. This is quite obvious now. Also, should modern society be equated with democracy? It's a major problem. But many people believe, myself included, that democratization process, the process of democratization, is unstoppable. It's a sign of modernity. More representational government, more people participating in the political process. Many forms of democracy, to be sure. The British is different from the French different from the German. All of them are very different from the American. And all the Western models are different from Japan. And by the way, which country, where is the largest democracy located? Yeah, great. India is the largest democracy. And yet, very complicated. The Indian democratic system is very different from all the Western Europeans. Another belief is that the emergence of civil society. By civil society, there are two conditions. One condition is that relatively independent social organizations between the government and the family, relatively independent social organizations, such as religious organization, academic organization, professional organization, various kinds of social organization or social movements, all these, they exist independent of the political center. This is one condition. You have to have forces, centers of influence, independent of the political center. The second condition is that each of the forces, independent of the political center, still has access to the political center through its influence. For example, the lobbying power in the United States. So a vibrant civil society, meaning aside from the government, the central government, there are other forces in the society that can shape the world, shape the condition or the quality of life of that society, not totally subsumed under the control of the government. If you want to compare China and the United States, there are many ways of doing that. One, of course, is in China, the state is much more powerful than society, whereas in America, society is much powerful than the state. And the federal government can also consider as one of those forces in shaping society, as true with many of the lobbying powers. An underlying value of all these developments in the modernizing process is often characterized as individualism, but I think it's probably better to simply characterize it as the dignity of the person. Otherwise, we'll not be able to talk about human rights, not be able to talk about the question of various kinds of ideas of liberalism. So the dignity of person is absolutely critical. And this general statement, this is the spheres of interest in the world today, shaped by science and technology, market economy, democratic polity, and civil society, and dignity of the person, this could be considered as the reason why the modern West, now the United States in particular, the modern West has been so powerful and influential. Now, I want you to keep in mind we've been working on Confucian ethics. Confronted with this new phenomena in the modern period, in what sense it can still be a persuasive ethic for us, not necessarily for those who are conditioned by in East Asia, they're very much shaped by Confucian ethics, but for us, in what sense some of these ideas and values are still relevant to us. In order to help us to understand this a little bit, first, I want to, again, it's very elementary, but I think it's important to go through this exercise. When we say East Asia, what are the countries that we include when we use the term East Asia? China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. Is Taiwan part of China? Now, I make a distinction between industrial East Asia and socialist East Asia. When we use the term industrial East Asia, we normally say Japan and the 4 mini dragons. You all know the 4 mini dragons? What are the 4 mini dragons? Okay, got it right. South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. Now, country called the Socialist East Asia. What are the countries in Socialist East Asia? People's Republic of China, Vietnam, and North Korea. Now, very interestingly, that Singapore and Vietnam are in Southeast Asia. So sometimes for cultural reasons, Vietnam is included. For ethnic reasons, Singapore is included because 70% of Singaporeans are ethnically Chinese. Now you have this, why we call East Asia, including Socialist East Asia and Industrial East Asia. The reason we call it is because of the Confucian tradition. Because these countries, I mean the contemporary situation, have all been under the influence for centuries of Confucian culture. Our Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations is organized to study East Asia, but East Asia precisely the so-called Confucian cultural world. So that's the cultural world. Sam Huntington, who is a professor of political science here, recently developed an idea of the clash of civilizations. When he used the term clash of civilizations, he has this problem in mind. So towards the 21st century, economic conflict, social conflict, military conflict, political conflict, all these conflicts are not as serious as the conflict of civilizations. Different religious conflicts, different ideas of learning to be human. And he singled out 2 major cultures outside of the modern West. They may present threats to the Western mode of thinking. The Western mode of thinking, as I just outlined, the influence of the West, now led by the United States. One is Islamic fundamentalism. The other one is what he called Confucian authoritarianism, the area that we've been studying. Now, part of the reason is because underlies this whole enterprise, and not just structures like market economy or democratic polity, but deeply held values. Deeply held values. And these values shaped our ethical outlook, shape our worldview. And the conflict of these values in the long run may turn out to be the most difficult to deal with. Even the conflict between China and the United States now, in addition to all the military and other problems, they are also conflict of perceptions, conflict of values. Or just simply, what is an apology is understood very, very differently. If you do not apologize, we don't want to talk to you. Well, if we apologize, that means that we made some mistake and we have legal obligation. We're not going to do that. Now, again, to help me, if we, this again at a very superficial level, what are some of the most powerful, important, enduring values of the modern West? Take into consideration of science, technology, market economy, democratic polity, civil society, and dignity of the individual. What are some of these values? Just a few. What are some of these values that are absolutely critical if we're part of the modern West? Yes? Okay, that's absolutely critical. Liberty. Anyone? Anyone else? Try one. Pardon me? Free? Greed? It's a value, I see. That's a surprise, but anyway, yes. Justice, okay. One thing is missing, interesting, but that's quite all right. Yes? Property, okay. from Locke. If you don't have, Mencius made the remark, if you don't have property, people who do not have property would not have a constant heart. Only those people who are cultivated, the profound person, the cultivated person, can have their constant heart even without property. But normally, you have to have property to have a sense of dignity. Yes? Independence. Couple more. Yes? Egalitarianism, let's say. Ambition? It's over here. Right. Upward mobility. Okay, that's opportunity to move up. Okay. Great. I think we have enough. Still, we missed a couple of them. I'm a bit surprised, but anyway, these are the let's say the value profile. We may want to have a sense of all the values here. Which one is really the most important, the totally irreducible, absolutely necessary? So any major disagreement? Which one, if I say liberty or freedom, liberty is the most important value in the modern West, would there be major disagreement? Now, this notion, liberty, is certainly related to independence, to upward social mobility, to, if you follow Locke, to property, to a certain extent, not totally unrelated to greed. The idea of a person as homo economus, as a person dictated by this particular notion, is a person who is a rational animal. So this is something I'm surprised nobody mentioned rationality, As a rational animal who knows his self-interest and who's able to maximize his profit in the marketplace, which is free, a free marketplace. But basically, another very important value which is missing, to my great surprise, is law. legal. So I would say law and rationality. So you can, but unfortunately, a major problem we face in the Enlightenment legacy is that many of the values are really in conflict. Please identify one of the major conflicts within this value profile. What are the two values that are both very powerful, important, and desirable, and yet they're in conflict? If you underscore one, you may somehow inadvertently lose the other. Now, we already identified liberty. Liberty sometimes is in conflict with what? Pardon me? Law is one? No? Okay, law. And equality. And of course, equality is closely linked to justice. In American society, I think there's unstated belief, very powerful, that liberty should never be sacrificed. Inequality can be tolerated. Some kind of injustice can be tolerated. You allow the society to be vibrant, to be dynamic, to be transformative. Liberty is absolutely critical. Liberty, of course, then related to the language of rights. Rights are sometimes in conflict with what? Rights. Duty or responsibility. So after the declaration, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, many heads of state, former heads of state, gather together and come up with the Declaration of Human Responsibility. But the liberal press was very unhappy with that declaration, considered that declaration as undermining the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the Declaration of Human Liberties. So in other words, we have the legacy. The legacy, internal to the legacy, there is some kind of conflict and tension. And the conflict and tension sometimes is resolvable, sometimes is not. There's even contradiction. And because of that, it is not a coherent orientation. It's very difficult for the human society as a whole to be shaped by this particular value orientation, because internal, in that structure, there's some kind of conflict and tension. If you look at this, the question then, I can go through this very quickly now with your help. That's liberalization of the self, liberty, which means freedom, is often linked to the idea of alienation. Peter Berger, the sociologist at Boston University, once made the remark that without alienation, there's no freedom. Sometimes we feel alienated from society, from family members, from politics. And that sense of alienation is absolutely critical for the development of a sense of independence and a sense of liberty. You don't have to follow his line of argument, but the sense of liberty has to do with the dignity of the person as an individual. But the rationality that is being promoted ever since the Enlightenment is a particular form of rationality. There are many forms of rationality. For example, one form of rationality, we call it communicative. How to talk to people. How to develop the rules of the game, then we can talk to people politely. That language is a communicative language which follows certain kind of communicative rationality. But the rationality that is particularly underscored in the modern West is instrumental rationality. And the instrumental rationality is based upon the formula of means and end. If I want to get something, what I need to do in order to get it. I have a clear notion, very pragmatic, very instrumental. The direct link between what the conditions that I want to specify and what I would be able to eventually manage to get it. The means and end dichotomy is for what the Chinese would call the calculative mind. Calculation. You can use a computer, you can use any kind of instrument, but it's a very clear calculation. It's also linked to the idea of manipulability. You can manipulate the situation in order to achieve it. Implicit in this also, of course, is the power of the human, especially science and technology. For the first time, we can not only shape our own society, but we shape the world as a whole. And we can actually control and conquer nature if we want to do that. And knowledge, by implication, is form of power. This is Bacon's notion that knowledge as power, as opposed to the earlier Greek idea of knowledge as wisdom. Power is power of manipulation, power of control. I want to digress just a little bit in order to bring this story to at least to a tentative conclusion. Globalization as localization for the first time recognizes that modernization as homogenization is not necessarily the inevitable outcome of westernization. In the 19th century, there's a process of westernization. In the 20th century, and people in the 20th century really believe in the modernizing process as a homogenizing process. But with the emergence in the last 20 years of the idea of globalization, we realized the following phenomenon. That is, all the primordial ties that we've been talking about, specifically ethnicity, gender, language, the land of birth, you say the land, class, the wealthy or the north and south problem, the age cohort, and faith. All these 6 or 7 dimensions. Write it down. Each one of them, say all of them, continues to be powerful in shaping the human condition. It's a strange phenomenon. The modernizing process, earlier when we talk about modernization, we think that the cultural differences will be undermined. And there will be no major cultural differences, then the convergence becomes possible. People in different places with the same level of modernization will be able to communicate with the same kind of language. But the globalizing process, through information technology, finance, tourism, migration, information, and of course disease, and so forth, the world becomes small. The world, that we can talk about the global village. But as the world becomes compressed into a village, it is not an integrated world. It becomes more differentiated, there's more difference, and more outright discrimination. The world becomes totally different. The world becomes even more conflictual, contradictory. The world has never been divided in terms of wealth, in terms of accessibility to information, idea. In all the human history, for the first time, that the world has been the most divided. People in New York, there are people who travel around the world on a monthly basis. There are also people who never travel across Brooklyn Bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan. People in the same block, some use internet, some don't, have totally different conceptions of the world, totally different perspectives. And yet, the primordial ties that the modernizing process, we talk about modernizing process, believe that could be undermined. People can become united despite differences. In fact, become more pronounced. If you look at ethnicity, Arthur Thelessingy Jr., is an American historian who taught at Harvard but now at NYU, he argued quite persuasively, if the United States cannot deal with the ethnicity, question of ethnicity effectively and urgently, even compassionately, then the United States can become disunited. If you look at gender, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, which is one of the most important intellectual traditions in the modern West, the role of women, the whole idea of how half of humanity ought to be treated in the workplace, in family, in the power structure, in economy, in authority, and all forms of life will have to be shaped. The Western society is much more sensitive to this, but all other societies have been affected. We used to think the language problem is related to the issues in places like South Asia, like India, 16 officially recognized languages and so forth. But if you look at Canada, look at Belgium, look at Spain, and even a place like Taiwan, the language problem becomes serious. Land is your birthplace. It's related to the question of nationalism. It's an issue not only in Native Americans, but Hawaiians, the Basque in Europe, and the Maori in Australia and New Zealand. We used to think the North and South problems, developing societies and developed societies. But now the North and South problem, which means problem of difference between different regions, the North and South problem is not only globally speaking, it's regionally speaking. Even within the same country, in the United States, there's North and South problem. Poverty-stricken communities still exist. Even the question of starvation is not totally eliminated. And so the North and South problem becomes significant all over the landscape. Age cohort. Well, we used to believe that 30 years constitute a generation. And now the time is very much reduced to 10, sometimes to 5. We used to think about the conflict between two different religious traditions, the Muslims and the Hindus, the Sikhs and the Buddhists, for example. But now we have to worry about intra-religious conflict. Within the same religious community, the people who are more orthodox, they're more traditional, and the people who are more liberal, more reform, within the religious community. So what you see, the globalizing process, it's a process of interconnectedness, a process of merge in different kind of structures. But at the same time, all the primordial ties I mentioned become more pronounced. The identity politics and so forth. And 4 trends of thought that emerged in the last, say, 30 years that help us to understand, despite the incredible power and influence of the modern West as informed by the Enlightenment mentality, many other traditions, including the Confucian tradition we've been studying, may still have some resources to offer. What are these 4 major trends? One is ecological consciousness. That only happened in our generation in the last 30 years, 20 to 30 years. The first Stockholm Conference on the environment was held in 1972. So that was the beginning of a global attempt to look at environment, very recent. And with that movement, then many of the great values that we talk about, all these values in a curious way are very much related to human relationships. So they're all anthropological and anthropocentric. We need a new relationship. That's the relationship between the human species and nature. And that is not at all implicit in the whole Enlightenment movement, in the whole emergence of the modern West, whether you talk about westernization or modernization. But globalization, you have to face up to that. With the Seattle protest and so forth, people become much more aware of that issue. The second movement is I would simply call it feminist sensitivity, feminism. Maybe I should ask you, what are the values that the feminists considered very important, very critical, and yet they're not up here? What are some of the values that they consider very critical in order to organize the human community? Maybe I can ask you to help us to get into that. To first, the three great values in the French Revolution, announced in the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. What does fraternity mean? Fraternity actually means community, brotherhood or sisterhood, community. But that idea, community, drop out of the picture. You know, three great ideas, right? Liberty, equality, and fraternity, which means community. Do we see community here at all? They're all individual-based, or anthropocentric, or anthropological. So we do have one community. I think the feminists very, very concerned about. Anyone else? Any other idea? Maybe one suggestion. Not part of the profile here, but very significant.
Family.
Okay, family. That's family. That's related to the question of community. It's a very good one, very important one. The value of the
and the importance of work.
Of work. Okay. We know in the modern West, the work ethic is an important one. The value of work, of course, but the work ethic is also. Maybe one more. You. Well, okay, sympathy. So anyway, the emergence of feminist sensitivity, again, is a new phenomenon that's never happened before, and present a very interesting rereading or a very challenging work towards this. The third movement is religious pluralism, cultural diversity, religious pluralism. And with religious pluralism, we realize we really have to develop a more nuanced idea about human relatedness. And then, of course, because of the emergence of the global village, the quest for global ethic. Now the question is, can we really develop global ethic based upon our notion of human rights? And of course, related to the question of justice. Can human rights discourse be the building block for universal ethic? Many people believe that's the only way out. There's no other way out. But then you have the question about cultural diversity. Now, in this context, then we can make a very summary statement that we begin to see that the Confucian tradition, as one of the many so-called axial age civilization traditions, first of all becomes totally marginalized because the Confucian tradition, as we understand it today, with not enough attention to the question of liberty, not enough or rich discussion of the question of rights, certainly not enough discussion of greed, of ambition, probably not enough discussion of property, and probably not enough discussion of independence or the autonomy of the individual. So there's so many important features of the modern, and not enough discussion of rights. Maybe a form of the rationality, rights, and even independence. So how a tradition that is being marginalized, if you look at the emergence of the modern West, and that still has something significant to offer, what kind of values, what kind of ideas that we've been studying so far can help us to formulate, I would call it, an imagined response. An imagined response to the influence of the modern West. Can we talk about liberalization of the person? Liberalization of the person not as an individual act, as the act of autonomous individual, but liberalization as also part of a communal effort. Is it possible for us to imagine that? It's a challenging question. Is it possible for us to understand justice? Justice basically as fairness, being fair to each other. This is, of course, Jack Rawls, our philosophers here, been trying very hard to develop this notion, justice as fairness. So how do we develop notion of justice? And the notion of justice, of course, it's rights-based, but more than just rights-based, it is also based upon the sense, the moral sense of being fair. One of the resources that we all know quite well, we will have a chance to explore, is this whole question about how we as human beings can re-establish a meaningful, harmonious, and sustainable relationship with nature. What kind of position that we have to have? We have to transcend anthropocentrism. We have to transcend the idea of power, knowledge as power, because that is linked to the politics of domination. We have to transcend the notion that we human beings can humanize the world in the sense of have dominion over the world. And we have to know something more than simply instrumental rationality. And of course, the perennial problem, one of the perennial problems of this process is the idea of politics of inclusion. How in the global community a politics of inclusion in terms of international order can be developed, which is linked to the notion how can we go beyond the idea that policies, national policies, can only be dictated by national interests. If we cannot go beyond the national interests to formulate a politics for the international community, that it's not possible to develop global ethic. There are a number of very, very interesting movements. At this juncture, they may be highly idealized, like the Earth Charter, like the UN's development of what they call the culture of peace, or this year as the dialogue of civilizations. Many, many attempts, international attempts. And yet, the overall global situation is very much dictated by the Enlightenment mentality. And do not mistake, I don't want to give you the mistaken impression that the idea of the politics of domination are simply restricted to the Western world in the sense of imperialism imposed upon the rest of the world. That's not the case at all. If you look at East Asia now, what we taught so-called Confucian East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, as well as the People's Republic China, North Korea, and Vietnam. This particular kind of mentality is pervasive. And in fact, the Enlightenment mentality is even more pronounced in China today than in the United States. It's a very interesting, intriguing phenomenon. China now worships science and technology, social engineering. I call it a form of scientism. The belief that we, through scientific method, through instrumental rationality, solve all the problems. The major project for hydraulic control of the Three Gorges, the Yangtze River, is very, very much dictated by this kind of vision. And the Chinese delegation refused to sign the preamble of 1972 Stockholm Conference because in the preamble there's a notion, there's a limit to growth. There's also a limit to science and technology. The Chinese delegation refused to accept it. There's no limit to growth. There's no limit to the power of science and technology. China probably now believes more in the market, the free market mechanism, than many of the thinkers and economists outside of China. And it is in this sense how China or Confucian East Asia will be able to retrieve some of the so-called Confucian values is a challenging issue, very challenging issue, not just a challenging issue for us. How can we see the relationship between some of those values to our lived world here and now, but how the so-called Confucian society will be able to retrieve their own indigenous cultural values without being totally overwhelmed by the modern West, by the modernizing project, or by the project of globalization. So for the next few sessions, we try to explore those issues, and each one of them I would ask for your help. I don't think I'll be able to give a comprehensive view on this.